From the Digital Media Center, on the campus of Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. This is Ramping Up Your English, an educational program for intermediate level English language learners. Here's your host for Ramping Up Your English, John Letts.
Welcome to Ramping Up Your English. This is our fourth program, Episode 4, Segment 1. Ramping Up Your English is for English language learners from all language backgrounds who've already begun the process of learning English as their second language. It's a program for people of all ages. If you're seeking greater English proficiency, this program is designed to help you reach that goal. We have two objectives today. We'll learn to use past perfect verbs to relate past events that predate other past events. And we'll use conjunctions to link thoughts that have a relationship between them. Ramping Up Your English is produced in Southern Oregon. Our theme of trains and railroads relates to this region of the country in an important way. The major towns and cities in Southern Oregon are all tied together by the first railroad in our region to link us to larger cities, like Portland in our state and San Francisco in California. Southern Oregon's largest city had its birth as a direct result of the location of the main north-south railroad line. Medford has already celebrated 100 years of its founding by the railroad, and land management decisions are still affected in Oregon by the construction of this railroad. So we'll start with this video clip about the history of railroads in Southern Oregon.
Anyway, I've been working on the railroad one song long. Oh yes. I've been working on the railroad all the live long day. I've been working on the railroad just to pass the time away. Nice. Can't you hear the whistle blow?
It took many people working on the railroad to lay out track all the way to the Pacific Ocean. When it was done in 1869, everything changed. The two great railroads, the Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific, joined to link both coasts. The Golden Spike was driven in.
So the world would know you could ride the train from Boston to Sacramento.
Yes, travel from coast to coast took only days now, and soon other transcontinental railroads were built. But in Southern Oregon, there was a wide gap filled only by bone-jarring stagecoach rides. Just like the Central Pacific, the Oregon and California Railroad turned to workers from China. The Oregon and California Railroad, known as the O&C, completed most of the track from Portland south to California, but Southern Pacific took over the line when O&C ran out of money. In Southern Oregon's Jackson County, it was assumed the rails would run through the county seat, Jacksonville. Instead, 4 landowners near Bear Creek donated their land for a depot, and the tracks were laid there. The economic boom for Medford was immediate and substantial. The city grew quickly, and the railway station became the bustling heart of town. Southern Pacific carried passengers between San Francisco and Portland right through Medford. The Siskiyou line, with many tunnels and steep grades, made the trip challenging for train crews. Yet the line continued, carrying passengers between San Francisco and Portland for many years, passing through Ashland, Medford, and Central Point. The depot at Medford still stands today. This is downtown Medford. We're in the middle of what used to be the whole nerve center of this town, because behind me is the old train station. Southern Pacific's main route from Portland down to San Francisco used to run right through Medford. And for years, this
train station that you see behind me was used by Southern Pacific. This is, in a sense, the heart or the birthplace of Medford. Medford owes its existence to the railroad. When the railroad decided to come down the middle of the Rogue Valley in this area, the Bear Creek Valley, I should say, they bypassed Jacksonville, the county seat, and built the railroad right through what is now Medford. So if you look behind me, you see the train station. Well, that was, you could say, the birthplace, because that's where Medford started. It was a railroad town. Now, it's no longer used by Southern Pacific, nor is the rail line going through here, but the building has been wonderfully refurbished and is now a restaurant.
Southern Pacific's main line ran through Medford until 1927, when it constructed a new line through the Willamette Pass. Yet it continued to serve Medford and the rest of the Rogue Valley, hauling freight. Other railroads sprung up in southern Oregon, some of them hauling logs and other natural resources, and some hauling passengers to Jacksonville. Some were bought by the Great Northern Railroad. All of them ran steam engines until well into the 20th century. Southern Pacific kept its presence in Medford, and southern Oregon for that matter, into the 1980s. Southern Pacific was a fierce competitor in Oregon, California, the Southwest, and into Louisiana. Its workers formed a solid union. Here's the Southern Pacific Caboose. This is where the train's conductor and the rear brakeman rode. This restored caboose in Medford's Railroad Park has a cooking stove and an elevated cupola. From up here, the conductor could see the whole train. On a curve, and there were plenty of curves in Oregon, the conductor could signal the engineer. Medford did not get to see the Shasta Daylight, a high-prestige streamliner. It used the Cascades route and never passed through Medford. Southern Pacific sold the Siskiyou line, and today a regional railroad struggles to serve southern Oregon shippers. Repairs on a tunnel in the Siskiyou Mountains should allow them to improve service soon. The best place to learn about Medford's railroad history is at Medford's Railroad Park. This indoor model railroad is faithfully built to show the regional railroads in 1989 in southern Oregon. In my brief visit, I learned that Medford was served by a railroad that ran deep into the mountains. It was the Pacific Eastern. Due to space limitations, some model railroad license was used, but model railroaders go to great lengths to have an accurate layout. If you're in the Medford area and have an interest in railroad history, this layout is open to the public twice a month from spring through fall. The Medford Railroad Park also has a museum, some restored train cars you can tour, and an outside model course that includes a Mesa Verde site. The real Anasazi ruins are a long, long way from Medford, but you can still learn a lot of local railroad history here. Oh, and those Sundays when they're open to the public, admission is free. While you're here, you might as well take a ride with Southern Oregon Live Steamers. You don't have to think too much about history. This ride is for fun. Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This ends segment 1 of episode 4. We'll return with segment 2 right after this. This is a Ramping Up Your English book review. An atlas is a collection of maps. A historic atlas is a collection of maps, photos, and illustrations that tells the reader about what happened in the past and where things happened. For the reader learning about the history of railroads, I recommend National Geographic's Historical Atlas of the United States.
Many aspects of American history are beautifully illustrated here, organized around themes like immigration and industrialization. Railroad history is included here, with simple yet poignant maps illustrating the expansion and then the decline of railroads in the United States through time. Readers can see the expanding effects of the Transcontinental Railroad and the erasing of many railroads after World War II, when automobiles, trucks, and airlines sapped away business from many of the railroads of the time. The atlas also contains regional maps of the United States. If you want to see graphic illustrations of railroad history, get your hands on a copy of National Geographic's Historical Atlas of the United States. You can probably find one at your local library. For Ramping Up Your English, I'm John Letts. Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This is Episode 4, Segment 2. In the video clip about railroads in Southern Oregon, we learned some important historical events. Anytime we look at history, we're seeing the need to use action words that reflect events of the past. In English, words conveying action and being are called verbs. In Episode 3, we reviewed the main way of changing present tense verbs to past tense. Then we ramped up a bit for some of you by using irregular verbs, those that don't form the past tense, by adding D or ED. I left a simple list on my website and provided a link to a much longer list on EnglishPage.com. What do you do when you want to show a change in the past in relation to another past event? That's the function we're learning today. Let's think about the video clip we just saw. There were some conditions that existed before the railroad was constructed in Southern Oregon. For example, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. A simple past tense would simply state that the Transcontinental Railroad was built. That clearly shows that it happened in the past. But if we use the fact in relation to the building of the railroad in Southern Oregon, which happened later but still in the past, the simple past tense will simply not do the job. We're going to show the relationship between these two facts. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, linking the East Coast with the West Coast. There was no railroad joining Southern Oregon to the East Coast until 1883. As shown here, there doesn't seem to be much of a connection. For the first sentence to show that this is a condition that existed before the second one, we're going to have to use the verb in the past perfect tense. The term perfect, as used here, simply means that something already happened in the past and it stopped happening. It's finished, like the Transcontinental Railroad. So they had already built the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. The two words "had built" make up the verb in this sentence. Both words are needed for the past perfect tense. Now let's look at the second half of what we're trying to say. There was no railroad in Southern Oregon linking it to the East Coast until 1883. Now let's put these two thoughts together to show the relationship between the two. They had already built the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, linking the East Coast with the West Coast. But there was no railroad in Southern Oregon linking it to the East Coast until 1883. As an intermediate English learner, you probably already know about using the conjunction but to join two phrases. However, without using the past perfect "had built," the sentence would not clearly communicate the relationship in time between the two events. Let's look at another way of saying the same thing. The Transcontinental Railroad had already been built 14 years earlier when Southern Oregon was finally connected to the rail in 1883. Continue with when communicating about events in the past, it's often necessary to use language for the function of fixing two or more events in time while showing a relationship between the two. That's when we use the word "had" as part of the verb to form the past perfect tense. Now, the word "had" is the past tense of the word "have." but here it's used as a helping verb joining to the participle of the word build. Used this way, the word had has nothing to do with possessing something. Let's go back to a slide. Let's look at another example from the video. It was stated that people in the past had to endure days of bumpy rides in a stagecoach to reach Southern Oregon from the nearest big cities. It was also stated that this situation changed when the railroad was completed into Southern Oregon. People had endured bumpy travel for days on stagecoaches to reach Southern Oregon from big cities in Oregon and California. Once the railroad was built, they traveled the same distance in a few hours by train. Adding had to the verb endured makes it clear that this situation only existed before the building of the railroad in Southern Oregon. In the second sentence, the past tense verb traveled puts this situation after the first one, yet still in the past. Had functions here as a helping verb. No helping verb was needed in the second sentence. If this all seems confusing or just too hard to remember, don't worry about that. Now that it's in your awareness, you'll more likely to notice it when you hear it or read it. And that's the value of watching the video clips and reading about a topic. Being able to use the verb in the past perfect form will help you communicate complex thoughts in a way that makes it clear what you're trying to say. Congratulations! You've just seen how you can use the past perfect verb tense to show a relation between two events that both happened in the past. This ends segment 2 of episode 4 of Ramping Up Your English. We'll return with a less bumpy segment right after this. This is a Ramping Up Your English book review. If you want to go back in time to the very birth of trains and railroads, you want to read the book The History of Railways by Colin Heinsohn from Scholastic Books. The book's format reminds me of eyewitness books with small illustrations and ample text. English learners will find that the text is very challenging and there's a lot of text on each page. The illustrations are clear, providing the context to help readers decipher the text. Historical photos depict important events like the Golden Spike ceremony that joined the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Railroads as America's first intercontinental railroad. There's a great amount of information in the history of railways. Readers will stretch their English reading skills, but you'll also be rewarded by a deeper knowledge of trains and railroads. Meanwhile, you'll be ramping up your English proficiency, especially in reading. For Ramping Up Your English, I'm John Letts. Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English. This is segment 3 of episode 4. In segment 1, we saw a video clip about bringing the railroad to Southern Oregon. In the second segment, we learned how to show how two events in the past are related using a verb in the past perfect tense. You can learn more about using past perfect tense at our website. Visit letscreate.org. Go to our episode 4 page and then follow the link to englishpage.com. If you're highly motivated to take a more grammar-centric approach to learning English, this is a great site. For a more thematic approach, I invite you to watch this video clip about excursion trains.
Today we learn about excursion trains, also called tourist trains. Excursion trains don't usually bring people to a destination. Riding the train is the destination. Local excursion trains like the Blue Goose in Wairika, California, offer a fun ride. I took my little brother to see if he liked the trains before taking him on our cross-country trip. Some excursion trains are better than others. The Cumbres and Toltec Railroad travels over part of the historic narrow-gauge line of the Rio Grande Railroad. from Chama, New Mexico to Antonito, Colorado, in the foothills of the San Juan Mountains. Like many excursion railroads, the Cumbus and Toltec uses steam engines, also called locomotives, to pull the train. In the United States, the driver of the train is called the engineer. He works with the firemen to operate the locomotive. Steam engines require a lot of water. Here the engine takes on water from an elevated tank or water tower. Once we were loaded with water, fuel, and passengers, our train took us to this scenic countryside. At times, the train crew had to stop and pour water on fires, set accidentally by sparks from the train. This was definitely a mountain railroad with high bridges called trestles and tunnels. This is one of the tunnels, what they look like inside. It gets very dark in the long tunnels. In English, we have a saying, we see the light at the end of the tunnel, meaning that things are going to get better. Steam engines produce smoke when pulling uphill. At stops, we were able to look over the giant metal wheels and pistons on the steam engine. Excursion trains delight rail fans, as well as people seeking beautiful scenery. And when it comes to scenery, you can hardly beat the White Pass and Yukon route in Alaska. We arrived at the Yukon station after taking a bus from the historic gold town of Skagway. This was a classic tourist train ride. We left Skagway to board the train and ride it back to Skagway. We began following the Yukon River, soon crossing the border back into the United States. The fog and mist gave this country a magical feel, as if riding a railroad through the clouds.
And folks, at this point, the tickets have been collected. So if you'd like to step up.
Through the fog, we saw this old railroad trestle. It's like we were seeing the ghost of a historic railroad. What was really spooky is as we followed this railroad with our eyes, we could see that it just ended abruptly. We'd see no trains on this trestle. The White Pass Railroad was built about 1900, only 2 years after the gold rush here. Before the railroad, gold miners trudged up this steep pass on foot. Some were then turned back by Canadian mounted police if they lacked sufficient supplies to live and work in this isolated region. From Skagway, Alaska, the miners set out in the deep snow to find and mine the claims up the river. When the railroad was built, they could cover the same distance that once took them several weeks in a matter of hours. But then they had to go further from there to stake their claims. Even from a distance, we could see the tracks crossing this tumbling creek on a bridge. When water crashes on rocks like this, it's forced to carry more oxygen, making it look white. We eventually descended to the level of the river. The clean water looks slightly milky. That's because it carries silt from upstream glaciers as they melt. That substance is called glacial flour, kind of like the flour people use to bake with. We're no longer following the Yukon River. This is the Skagway River. It flows to Skagway, Alaska. So does the railroad.
Welcome back to Ramping Up Your English, supporting you in your quest for greater English proficiency. This is the end of Episode 4, Segment 3. You'll find more resources at our website, letscreate.org. You can also watch or download this program and others by going to archive.org/letscreate. RUE.com/details/Rogue TV. I want to thank my technical crew for their awesome work in making this program possible. I also want to thank the helpful and encouraging staff of RVTV for their help. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for watching. We'll be back for episode 5 of Ramping Up Your English. I'm John Letts.
You've been watching Ramping Up Your English, a support program for intermediate level English language learners. Learn more. Visit our website at letscreate.org. You can also watch or download today's program at archive.org/details/Rogue TV. Join us next time on RVTV Voices for Ramping Up Your English.